Right, so welcome back. So this is part 5 in our lecture on bones in the axial skeleton. And in this video, and in this part, we're going to look at the nature of different bone fractures, so different bone breaks, the different types, and then we'll look at how we repair them, and then we'll look at kind of a clinical correlation, a clinical condition that can lead to an increased risk for developing fractures. So let's look at some of these images here, and you tell me if you think it's broken. So do you think this image here is broken? What about this one? What about this one, right? So all of these are very obviously broken, and you have different types, right? So in general, you have what are called open and closed fractures. Open meaning um, it is um, it is sticking out of the skin. Sometimes it's referred to as a compound fracture, and then closed meaning that it is not out of the skin. You also have transverse fractures and oblique fractures in terms of the orientation that the bone is actually broken. You have ones like this one in the middle. This would likely be referred to as a comminuted fracture, in which all of the little bone fragments that break are smaller pieces and they all kind of stay around in the same area. So you have lots of different um, types of breaks, and obviously to for sure identify a break if it's not compound, if it's not open to the environment where you can see it, you have to get a radiograph like one of these in order to definitively diagnose it. And then you can set the bone, you can set it with a cast, and then it will undergo its healing process. And so that's what we'll talk about next is how bones heal. So bone repair. So when bones go through the process of repair, they go through a couple of phases. So first, you have the damage to the bone itself, and we said in one of our last parts that bone is vascular, right? Meaning it has a blood supply. And so with this idea that bone is vascular, you develop something known as a fracture hematoma, right? So a hematoma is kind of this collection or this pooling blood in kind of a centralized area. And so a fracture hematoma is this collection and pooling of blood in the area immediately surrounding the fracture, right? So this allows blood cells to come to the area. It allows immune cells, so white blood cells, to come to the area and begin degrading and potentially getting rid of any foreign pathogens that may have entered during the break. And then we'll also see that it begins to get rid of some of that now dead bone, the dead bone cells that are being deprived of nutrients as a result of the fracture. All right. So that's this first stage that you see here in the upper left corner. Second is you develop what's called a callus. All right. And you have what's called an internal and an external callus. These serve to begin the process of joining the two ends of the bone back together. All right. So you have fibroblasts come in and lay down new collagen. You have initially you have some areas of spongy bone. You also have some areas of cartilage as well. So some hyaline cartilage that begins to develop surrounding the bone here. And so the internal callus would be kind of more on the inside between the two bones, and then the external would be more out here. Now, over a period of time and over a period of weeks during this healing process, you begin to replace this cartilage that we kind of see here. This is the blue, so this chondroblast here, this is showing a cartilage cell that's laying down cartilage. Over the coming days and weeks after you break it and you begin to heal, you then develop what's called a bony callus or a hard callus, in which you replace the spongy bone and you replace the cartilage with now new compact bone, right? So you have osteoblasts come in, or you would have osteoclasts come in, kind of degrade and break down some of the spongy bone, and then right behind it, you would have osteoblast come in and lay down new hard compact bone. All right. And so what that does is that leads to kind of the fourth part is this phase of bone remodeling, where you kind of have this constant degrading and resorption of some of the bone and then the laying down of new bone. And then over a period of time, the um, the bone ends up being really as strong as it was, sometimes a little bit stronger. And if a bone is to break again, it usually breaks in a different area, right? So that one area that you've previously broken is now healed, it's now strong and sometimes stronger than it had been. And so it's less likely to fracture there. And so the surrounding areas are now more likely to fracture if a bone is going to fracture. So if you're going to break it again, it's likely to be at a different location, right? So you can see the same sequence of events right here. So you have that fracture hematoma form on the far left. You develop an internal and external callus. So you have this spongy bone being laid down. You have cartilage as well. lay down the spongy bone trabecula. You then begin to replace that with um, or all the cartilage with spongy bone, so you get this hard bony callus, and then you begin to replace some of that spongy bone with compact bone, and then you have your healed fracture. And you can see this on actual bones that have been fractured and have been repaired. You have this kind of swelling on the outside, and the swelling is a representation of where the fracture took place, where the bones were broken, and then where you had the hematoma form, where you had the internal and external calluses form, as well as the bony callus form. So there's a video here that's in your lecture PowerPoint that you can play. I'm not going to play through it. So one important kind of clinical correlation and clinically related issue related to bones is osteoporosis, right? And so we've all heard of osteoporosis. Osteoporosis means porous bone, right? So the term osteo is referring to bone here. And this is an extremely common bone disease. So what you have take place in osteoporosis is essentially an uneven activity between osteoblasts and osteoclasts, right? So if you think of the role of these cells, osteoblasts are laying down collagen and laying down osteoids, so leading to the production of new bone. Osteoclasts are resorbing bone through enzymes and hydrochloric acid. And so one is making bone, one is taking away bone. And so in osteoporosis, in which you have this porous bone or this weak bone, you have your osteoclasts that are taking away bone begin to outpace and exceed the activity of osteoblasts. When this happens, you get a net loss of bone, and by having a net loss of bone, the bones by virtue become weaker. You can have these symptoms here. You may be stooped in posture, especially if this happens to the vertebrae. So the kind of anterior part of the vertebrae begin to collapse and you begin to fall down, kind of stoop down. It also drastically increases your risk for fractures. So because of this weak, porous bone now, you have less compact bone. Any type of fall or bump into something, and sometimes it can even occur in older individuals just by standing up, by the strain and stress put on your bones by standing up, that can even sometimes result in a fracture, right? So there are scans. There's one called a DEXA scan that can measure bone density in terms of identifying whether or not you have this disease. And you treat it through a couple of things. One, you can do hormonal replacement, particularly for women. So during menopause, a drop off in estrogen levels can result in less mineralization of the bone. You can give a hormone called calcitonin, and we'll talk about calcitonin here in a little bit. It's a hormone that serves to actually decrease blood calcium levels. And so by decreasing blood calcium, you put the calcium back into the bones. You can have a balanced diet, so making sure you're eating foods and consuming things that have a rich supply of calcium, and then also an active lifestyle. So this kind of goes back to what we talked about in the last lecture with Wolff's Law, in the sense that our bones respond to the physical and mechanical stressors put on them. And so by having an active lifestyle, and active meaning you're doing some type of weight bearing activity. Okay, so you're walking, you're running, you're doing jump rope, you're doing something. Weight bearing activities do not include things like biking. Okay, that's not really a weight bearing activity. Swimming, although swimming is very good for you, it's not really a weight bearing activity. So something where you're walking, you're moving around physically, putting mechanical stress and force on your bones, that's going to drive calcium into the bones. All right. So you can see this here. This is just a graph showing kind of the relationship between age and bone mass and bone growth between males and females. And you see that females overall generally have a smaller bone mass, a lesser bone mass, and then they have a very steep drop off related to menopause as a result of the loss of estrogen that occurs after menopause. Whereas males, they don't have those same hormones acting in the same way. Men still have many of the same hormones, but they're not acting in the same way, and so their bone mass typically it declines and it decreases as they age, but not to the extent that it occurs in women. All right, so this is a kind of visual representation of what's happening. So this is normal bone, osteoblast to some degree, osteoclast to some degree. The balance between bone synthesis or formation and bone resorption is relatively equal. And in osteoporosis, you have osteoclast greatly outweighing the activity of osteoblast. Okay, and then this is the same thing, but it's more of a comic. So here's our bone. You have osteoclast taking away some. You have osteoblast building some, and then osteoporosis. You still have osteoblast building some, but you have osteoclast that are very out of control. They are they've drastically exceeded the activity of osteoblast, so you get this massive net loss of bone, this massive net loss of bone. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we're going to pick up with the next part, part 6, by talking about the process of ossification.